My name is Ashton, 68 years old, and a retired construction company owner. At my only son Thomas's wedding last year, I found myself seated with the kitchen staff in a back room, while the celebration I helped pay for continued without me. As the server apologetically handed me leftover food, my new daughter-in-law Natalie leaned in and whispered, "Be grateful you're even here." Little did they know, this was the final test for my Aunt Eleanor's secret $3.2 million inheritance. Before I continue my story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and if this resonates with you, please subscribe and join me for more real-life stories. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, where most folks worked with their hands and took pride in honest labor. My father was a carpenter who taught me everything about building things that last. By 24, I had saved enough to start my own construction business. It began with small renovation jobs, but through hard work and dedication, I gradually built a reputation for quality and reliability. Within 10 years, Ashton Construction became one of the most respected companies in our county. During those early years, I met Margaret, the love of my life. She was a kindergarten teacher with a gentle smile and endless patience. We married after just 6 months of dating, both certain we had found our perfect match. Margaret supported me through the uncertain times of starting a business, often keeping the books late into the night after teaching all day. She believed in me when I barely believed in myself. 3 years into our marriage, Thomas was born. He was a bright, curious boy who brought immeasurable joy to our lives. I still remember holding him for the first time, his tiny fingers wrapping around mine. In that moment, I promised to give him everything I never had growing up. Margaret and I created a warm, loving home for our son, and for 8 wonderful years, our little family was complete. Then came the darkest day of my life. Margaret began experiencing unusual fatigue and pain. After weeks of tests, we received the devastating diagnosis, stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave her 6 months. She fought bravely for 8, but in the end, cancer took my beautiful wife, leaving me to raise our 8-year-old son alone while running a growing business. Those first months without Margaret were nearly impossible. I would wake up reaching for her, only to find cold sheets beside me. Thomas would ask questions about death that I had no answers for. We grieved together, this little boy and I, learning to navigate a world that suddenly felt empty. But for Thomas's sake, I had to keep moving forward. Balancing single fatherhood with a construction company wasn't easy. I would wake at 5 to prepare Thomas's lunch and breakfast, drop him at school, work a full day, then rush back for school pickup. Evenings were filled with homework help, dinner preparation, and trying to be both mother and father to a grieving child. Many nights, after Thomas went to bed, I would return to blueprints and bids until midnight. Despite these challenges, Thomas and I developed a special bond. On weekends, we would go fishing at Lake Monroe, just sitting quietly together as the sun rose over the water. During summer breaks, I began bringing him to construction sites, teaching him the trade just as my father had taught me. By 12, he could frame a basic wall. By 14, he understood blueprints. I wanted him to value hard work and appreciate the dignity of physical labor, even if he chose a different path later. As Thomas entered high school, I noticed his growing interest in business rather than construction. He excelled in math and economics, often asking sophisticated questions about company finances. I encouraged this curiosity, hoping he might someday take over the administrative side of Ashton Construction while I handled the building aspects. When he expressed interest in attending business school, I supported him fully, though it meant stretching our finances thin. I had built a comfortable life for us, but elite college tuition was beyond my regular means. So, I took on additional projects, working weekends and holidays, to ensure Thomas could attend the prestigious university he set his heart on. Sometimes I would drive 4 hours each way just to see his soccer games, arriving dusty from the job site but bursting with pride. Those were exhausting years, but seeing Thomas thrive made every sacrifice worthwhile. However, something began to change during his sophomore year of college. Thomas started coming home less frequently, and when he did, he seemed different. He traded his casual clothes for designer brands I couldn't pronounce. He spoke of classmates whose parents owned multiple homes and took exotic vacations. For the first time, I sensed him comparing our modest 4-bedroom house unfavorably to the wealth his new friends enjoyed. After graduation, Thomas moved to New York for a finance position with a starting salary higher than what I earned after 30 years of building my company. I was proud of his achievement, but noticed how rarely he mentioned my contribution to his success. The calls became less frequent, the visits even more so. Then came the cocktail party where Thomas met Natalie. She was from an old money family with connections throughout Manhattan's elite circles. Her father owned a chain of luxury hotels, and she worked as their marketing director. When Thomas first brought her to meet me, her designer outfit probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. "Your home is so quaint," she said, examining my living room with a forced smile. "It has such character." I recognized the condescension in her tone but smiled politely for Thomas's sake. Over dinner, Natalie spoke almost exclusively about her family's properties, their vacation home in the Hamptons, and the charity galas she attended. Not once did she ask about my business or life. Thomas, to my disappointment, seemed to hang on her every word, occasionally glancing at me as if worried I might say something embarrassing. After they left, I sat alone in my kitchen, realizing my son was drifting toward a world where people were valued by their wealth rather than their character. It broke my heart, but what could I do? He was an adult making his own choices. The changes became more pronounced over the next year. Thomas started canceling our standing monthly phone calls. When I drove to New York to surprise him for his birthday, he seemed uncomfortable introducing me to his colleagues, quickly explaining I was just passing through town rather than acknowledging I had driven 6 hours specifically to see him. During that same visit, I overheard him telling Natalie, "Dad just doesn't understand our lifestyle." The words stung more than he could know. Around this difficult time, my Aunt Eleanor reached out. Though we weren't particularly close, she had always been fond of me and had occasionally sent Thomas birthday cards. Eleanor had married wealthy and lived a comfortable life, but unlike many in her social circle, she never forgot her humble beginnings. "Money reveals character, it doesn't create it," she told me over lunch at her elegant townhouse. "I've been watching how Thomas treats you, Ashton. It concerns me." Eleanor explained that she was updating her will and considering leaving a substantial portion of her estate to Thomas, but she had reservations about how sudden wealth might affect him. "I want to see if he values family and respect more than money," she said thoughtfully. "Would you be willing to help me test his character?" I was uncomfortable with the idea at first, but Eleanor's plan made sense. She would create a trust with specific conditions. Thomas would inherit if he demonstrated genuine respect and care for family, particularly me. If not, the money would go to the trade school scholarship fund Eleanor supported. Either way, a smaller trust would be established for any future grandchildren. "You won't tell him about this, of course," Eleanor instructed. "People show their true nature when they think there's nothing to gain." 3 months after this conversation, Eleanor passed away peacefully in her sleep at 92. As per our agreement, my lawyer Franklin became executor of this portion of her estate, with instructions to observe Thomas's behavior toward me, especially during significant family events. Just weeks after Eleanor's funeral, Thomas called with news. "Dad, Natalie and I are engaged. We're planning the wedding for next spring at Crystal Bay Resort." The excitement in his voice was genuine, and for a moment, I felt hopeful this milestone might bring us closer. "That's wonderful, son. I'm so happy for you both," I replied, meaning every word despite my complicated feelings about Natalie. "Great, we'll send you the details soon," he said hurriedly. "Got to run to a dinner reservation. Love you, Dad." The call ended before I could respond. Little did I know then that this wedding would become the final test in Eleanor's carefully designed plan. The wedding invitation arrived just 3 weeks before the date, a thick cream envelope with gold embossing that felt out of place among my regular mail. Inside, an elaborate card announced the marriage of Thomas James Lawson to Natalie Elizabeth Harrington at Crystal Bay Resort, one of the most exclusive venues on the East Coast. Something felt off about receiving the invitation so late. When I mentioned it during a call with my nephew Jackson, he revealed his family had received theirs nearly 6 months earlier. "We booked our flights back in January," he said, confusion evident in his voice. "Didn't Thomas tell you?" Trying to ignore the sting of this revelation, I called Thomas, who answered on the 5th ring. "Dad, I'm heading into a meeting. What's up?" "I just got the wedding invitation," I said. "I wanted to confirm you'd like me there." There was a pause. "Of course we want you there," he replied, though his tone lacked conviction. "Sorry about the late notice." Natalie's assistant must have missed your name on the initial mailing list." "I see," I said, though I didn't really. "How could the father of the groom be forgotten? I'll make arrangements. Is there anything specific you'd like as a gift?" "Honestly, Dad, just your presence is enough," Thomas answered quickly. "Natalie's parents are handling most expenses. We've registered at Hamilton's if you want to check that out." After hanging up, I looked at the registry online and found items priced from $500 to several $1,000s. While I could afford something from the list, none of the crystal vases or imported china seemed personal. Instead, I spent the next 2 weeks in my workshop creating a handcrafted wooden chest from cherry wood, the same wood Margaret and I had chosen for Thomas's crib. Inside, I placed a check for $10,000, a significant amount for me, along with a letter expressing my love and hopes for his marriage. The week before the wedding, I prepared my best suit, the one I reserved for special client meetings and important occasions. It wasn't designer quality, but it was well made and dignified. Margaret had always said the navy blue brought out my eyes. The thought of her missing this milestone brought a familiar ache. She would have known how to navigate these new complexities with our son. The drive to Crystal Bay took nearly 5 hours. While Thomas and his guests would be staying at the resort itself, the rooms there were far beyond my budget at $800 per night. Instead, I booked 3 nights at a modest hotel 20 minutes away. After checking in, I called Thomas to let him know I had arrived safely. "Great, Dad," he replied over background noise. "We're just heading to the rehearsal dinner. See you tomorrow at the ceremony." "I thought immediate family was included in the rehearsal dinner," I said, trying to keep disappointment from my voice. Another pause. "We had to limit numbers. Natalie's family is quite large. Tomorrow will be the main event anyway." Before I could respond, he added, "Sorry, Dad, they're calling us to start. Got to go." That evening, I ate alone at a local diner, wondering how the joyful little boy who once begged for piggyback rides had transformed into someone who could so casually exclude his only parent from important family moments. The following morning, I arrived at Crystal Bay Resort an hour early, navigating past luxury vehicles to the valet stand. The young attendant gave my 15-year-old sedan a dubious look before taking my keys. At the security checkpoint, I was detained until they made a phone call to verify I was indeed the father of the groom, despite my name being on their list. The resort itself was breathtaking, with sweeping ocean views and meticulously landscaped grounds. Elaborate flower arrangements lined the pathway to the ceremony area, where white chairs were arranged in perfect rows facing an ornate altar. The display of wealth was overwhelming, probably costing more than the combined value of all the homes I had built in the past decade. I spotted Thomas near a side building, surrounded by groomsmen in matching tuxedos. My heart swelled seeing my son looking so handsome and grown up. I approached with a smile, gift box in hand. "Dad, you made it," Thomas said, giving me a quick, distracted hug. "You can leave that with the gift attendant." He gestured toward a table piled with elaborately wrapped packages. "I'd rather give it to you personally," I said. "I made it myself." A flicker of embarrassment crossed his face. "That's nice, but we're about to take photos. Can I find you after?" Before I could answer, a wedding coordinator whisked him away. Reluctantly, I placed my handcrafted gift among the designer packages, feeling as out of place as it looked. Near the refreshment table, I was introduced to Natalie's parents. Mr. Harrington barely looked up from his phone during our handshake, while Mrs. Harrington offered a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "So you're the contractor," she said, examining me. "Thomas mentioned you built houses." "I owned a construction company," I corrected gently. "I built custom homes for 35 years before retiring." "How quaint," she replied. The same word her daughter had used in my home. Natalie's grandfather started with just one hotel too. Now the Harrington name is on 36 properties worldwide. As I searched for a response, I overheard Natalie speaking to her maid of honor nearby. "Can you believe his suit? It's off the rack." She laughed softly. Thomas wanted to buy him something appropriate, but he insisted on wearing his own. "At least he's not in work boots." I moved away, pretending not to have heard, and found a quiet corner to collect myself. A familiar voice broke through my thoughts. "Uncle Ashton?" My nephew Jackson approached with a warm smile. "You holding up okay? This crowd's a bit much, isn't it?" Jackson's genuine concern was a balm to my wounded spirit. Margaret's brother's son had always stayed close, calling regularly and visiting when his job as a teacher allowed. Unlike Thomas, he never seemed embarrassed by our family's modest background. "I'm fine," I assured him, though we both knew it wasn't entirely true. Just taking it all in. "Listen," Jackson lowered his voice. "I overheard some things about the seating arrangements. If anything uncomfortable happens, come find me and Amanda, okay?" Before I could ask what he meant, the wedding planner began directing guests to their seats. Jackson squeezed my shoulder supportively before joining his wife. As people filed toward the ceremony area, I drew strength from memories of Margaret. She would want me to hold my head high regardless of how I was treated. Our son was getting married, and despite everything, that was worth celebrating. Near the ceremony entrance, I ran into Kevin Williams, Thomas's childhood best friend. He looked genuinely happy to see me. "Mr. Lawson. Man, it's been years." He embraced me warmly. "Your son's done well for himself, huh? This place must cost a fortune." "It certainly appears that way," I replied. Kevin's expression grew serious. "You know, Thomas and I still catch up occasionally. Last time, he hardly mentioned you. What's up with that? You were like a second father to me growing up." I shrugged, uncomfortable discussing family matters. "People change, Kevin. Priorities shift." "Well, they shouldn't shift that much," he muttered, looking around at the ostentatious display. "This doesn't even seem like the Thomas I knew. The guy who helped me build that treehouse in 7th grade wouldn't care about crystal champagne flutes and caviar stations." As we talked, I observed the arriving guests, noting their designer attire and confident demeanor. They moved through the space, as if entitled to every luxury, so different from the hard-working people I had known all my life. For the first time, I truly questioned whether I belonged in my son's new world. When the usher approached to escort me to my seat, I naturally assumed I would be in the front row, the traditional place for parents of the bride and groom. Instead, he led me to the very last row, behind distant relatives and colleagues I had never met. I wanted to object but decided against causing a scene at my son's wedding. So I sat quietly, wedged between a cousin of Natalie's I had just met and an empty chair. From this distance, I strained to see Thomas standing at the altar. Despite everything, emotion welled up in my throat. My boy, my only child, was getting married. I thought of Margaret and how she would have beamed with pride, regardless of the circumstances. I wished she could have been here to see the little boy we had raised together become a husband. The ceremony itself was elaborate beyond anything I had ever witnessed. Thousands of white roses and orchids formed a canopy over the altar. A string quartet played, as Natalie appeared in a gown that probably cost more than my first house. She was beautiful, I had to admit, though her smile seemed practiced rather than joyful. During the ceremony, the officiant spoke about family support and tradition, asking guests to honor the generations that came before. I noticed he specifically mentioned Natalie's wonderful parents who provided such a strong foundation, but there was no corresponding acknowledgement of Thomas's family. Just another small slight that added to my growing discomfort. After the vows were exchanged and the couple declared married, guests were directed to the resort's grand lawn for photographs. I naturally moved toward the area where Thomas and Natalie stood with her parents, assuming I would be included in family photos. The photographer was organizing people into groups when he asked, "Where is the father of the groom?" Before I could step forward, Natalie's wedding planner interjected, "We're doing immediate family first, then extended family later if time permits." I stood awkwardly to the side as dozens of photos were taken with Natalie's extended family, including distant cousins and family friends. The immediate family photos stretched on for 30 minutes, yet I was never called forward. Eventually, the photographer announced they needed to move on to the reception, and the opportunity for my inclusion disappeared. Guests began migrating toward the reception hall, a grand ballroom overlooking the ocean. With no one to walk with, I found myself alone during the cocktail hour, standing by a high table with a glass of water while others networked in animated groups. The bartender noticed my isolation and offered a sympathetic smile. "First time at Crystal Bay, sir?" "Yes," I replied. "My son is the groom." His eyebrows rose slightly. "The groom? Would you like something stronger than water then?" "On the house." I accepted a scotch, grateful for the small kindness. "Been working here long?" I asked. 5 years, he replied while mixing a cocktail for another guest. "Seen hundreds of weddings. Family dynamics can get complicated at these things." "That's putting it mildly," I agreed. taking a sip of my drink. As servers began directing guests to their tables for dinner, I realized I still didn't know where I was supposed to sit. I approached a table with a seating chart, scanning the elegant calligraphy for my name. Oddly, I couldn't find it among any of the 20 tables listed. Confused, I asked a nearby coordinator. She checked her clipboard with a frown. Lawson. Ashton Lawson? Let me see. Her expression changed to one of discomfort. Oh, I see. You're actually seated in the Windsor room. Is that another section of the ballroom? I asked. She hesitated. Not exactly. If you'll follow me, please. I followed her through the main reception area, past tables of elegantly dressed guests, through a service door, and down a hallway to a smaller room separated from the main celebration. Inside were 3 round tables, primarily occupied by photographers, band members, and catering staff on their breaks. One empty chair had a small card with my name. There must be some mistake, I said, stunned. I'm the father of the groom. The coordinator's face flushed. I'm so sorry, sir. The seating arrangements were approved by the bride personally. I assumed you knew. In that moment, I felt a humiliation so profound it was physically painful. My son had allowed his bride to seat me with the staff, completely removed from the celebration I had driven 5 hours to attend. I'll speak to the event manager, the coordinator offered, clearly embarrassed on my behalf. No need, I said with as much dignity as I could muster. I'll speak with my daughter-in-law myself. I returned to the main ballroom, where I found Natalie surrounded by bridesmaids near the head table. When she saw me approaching, her smile faltered slightly. Natalie, I said quietly, there seems to be a misunderstanding about my seating arrangement. Her perfect composure never wavered. No misunderstanding, Ashton. We had limited space in the main ballroom for VIP guests. I'm sure you understand. I'm Thomas's father, I reminded her, keeping my voice low. Traditionally, parents are seated at the family table. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper only I could hear. Be grateful you're even here. Thomas wanted a smaller wedding, but I insisted on including you. Her eyes flickered to where Thomas stood chatting with guests, deliberately looking away from our interaction. Don't make a scene. It would only embarrass him further. The calculated cruelty of her words left me speechless. I glanced at Thomas, silently willing him to intervene, to notice what was happening. He pretended not to see, turning slightly away to engage deeper in conversation with Natalie's father. In that moment, I made a decision that would ultimately change everything. I would stay. Not because I accepted this treatment, but because leaving would be exactly what they wanted. Plus, I needed to see how far this would go, for reasons beyond my personal feelings. I returned to the Windsor room and took my assigned seat. The staff members already seated looked uncomfortable, clearly recognizing the awkward situation. I'm Maria, said the woman beside me, a photographer based on her equipment. You're the groom's father, right? I took pictures of him growing up. That's me, I confirmed, extending my hand. Ashton Lawson. This is Carlos, our lighting technician, she continued, indicating a young man across the table. And that's Damon and Jessica from the band. They all nodded politely, the awkwardness palpable. Damon broke the tension. Well, sir, I'd say we have the better company in here, wouldn't you? His kind attempt to lighten the mood worked. I smiled genuinely for the first time that day. I believe you're right. As we chatted, I observed how the staff interacted with each other. There was a camaraderie and authenticity absent from the formal interactions in the main ballroom. These were hard-working people who reminded me of my own employees over the years. A memory surfaced of taking 8-year-old Thomas to job sites and teaching him to thank every worker by name. These men and women are building our clients' dreams with their hands, I'd told him. Everyone deserves respect, regardless of their job title. The boy who had nodded earnestly that day seemed worlds away from the man who had allowed his father to be seated with the help. In this moment of reflection, I thought about Aunt Eleanor and her careful observations of character. The conditions of her will seemed almost prophetic now. When dinner service began, the contrast between the main reception and our room became even more apparent. Through the occasionally open door, I glimpsed servers presenting elaborately plated appetizers to the guests in the ballroom. Multi-course meals were delivered with choreographed precision, fine wines poured from bottles I recognized as extremely expensive vintages. Meanwhile, in our room, a different server appeared with plates that were clearly different from what was being served in the main reception. The food looked hastily assembled from whatever was available. "I'm sorry, sir," the young waitress said quietly as she set a plate before me. "These are the staff meals. I wasn't told you'd be seated here until just now." She looked genuinely distressed on my behalf. "It's all right," I assured her, though my heart sank further. "I appreciate your service." As I looked down at the plate of clearly leftover food, another memory surfaced. 10-year-old Thomas had once accompanied me to a site where we were finishing a custom home for a wealthy client. The client had catered lunch for themselves, but provided nothing for the construction crew. Thomas, noticing this inequality, had asked why our workers had to bring sandwiches while the clients ate catered food. "Some people forget that we're all equally deserving of respect," I had explained. "But we never forget that, right?" Thomas had nodded solemnly before asking if we could order pizza for everyone. I had been so proud of his compassion that day. The current situation felt like a painful inversion of that lesson. My son had not only forgotten to treat everyone with respect, but he had deliberately placed his own father among those he considered unworthy of proper treatment. As I quietly ate the subpar meal, my mind drifted to Aunt Eleanor and the day she had explained her inheritance plans to me. What most people didn't know was that Eleanor had secretly observed Thomas's behavior for years before making her decision. She had attended his high school graduation, sitting in the back unnoticed, watching how he interacted with me afterward. She had observed how quickly he introduced his college friends to Natalie's family, but seemed reluctant to include me in social gatherings. "Money doesn't corrupt character, Ashton," Eleanor had told me. "It reveals it. Thomas will show who he truly is through his actions, especially when he thinks there's nothing material to gain from you." The conditions of her will were specific. Thomas would inherit $3.2 million only if he demonstrated genuine respect and care for family, particularly me. Franklin, her lawyer and the executor, would make the final determination based on observed behavior. If Thomas failed this character test, the entire sum would go to establishing trade school scholarships for disadvantaged youth, with a small trust still set aside for any grandchildren, regardless of the outcome. "You okay, sir?" The waitress had returned, noticing I had barely touched my food. "Just remembering something," I replied with a small smile. She lowered her voice. "My dad wasn't invited to my sister's wedding last year, said he wasn't sophisticated enough for her new in-laws. Family can be cruel sometimes." Her understanding was unexpected but welcome. "How did your father handle it?" He said, "Living well is the best revenge." She straightened up professionally. "Can I get you anything else?" "I'm fine, thank you." As she walked away, I found myself drawing strength from the simple human connection. Through the open door, I caught glimpses of Thomas at the head table, sitting between Natalie and her father, laughing and appearing completely at ease. Once, our eyes briefly met across the distance. For a moment, I thought I saw discomfort flicker across his face, but he quickly looked away, reaching for his champagne glass. Natalie was in her element, commanding attention from everyone around her. She made a show of feeding Thomas a bite of cake, posing perfectly for the photographer. Every gesture seemed calculated for appearance, rather than genuine affection. The toasts began in the main room, the sound system carrying voices into our separate area. Natalie's father spoke at length about the perfect union of two exceptional young people and the joining of two distinguished families. Natalie's maid of honor told stories of their elite boarding school adventures. When the best man introduced Thomas for his speech, I listened carefully as my son thanked Natalie's parents profusely for their generosity, the wedding planner for her vision, and their friends for attending. Not once did he mention me or his mother's memory. Just as the speeches seemed concluded, an older gentleman approached the microphone. I recognized him as Margaret's uncle, Philip, who had remained close to us after her passing. "I'd like to acknowledge someone very important to this occasion," he began. "Ashton Lawson, Thomas's father, who raised this fine young man alone after the untimely loss of his wonderful mother, Margaret." A murmur rippled through the crowd as heads turned, searching for me. Of course, I wasn't visible from the main room. Natalie quickly stood, smoothly taking the microphone. "Thank you for that lovely sentiment. Now, if everyone will join us for our first dance." Her interruption was skillful but obvious. She directed attention to the dance floor, effectively cutting off any recognition of my contribution to Thomas's life. When champagne was served for toasts in the main ballroom, no glasses were brought to our room. One of the band members noticed and discreetly shared his flask with me. "Dutch courage," he said with a wink. "Seems like you could use some." The bass player nodded toward the main room. "Been playing weddings for 15 years. Never seen a father of the groom treated like this. You're handling it with more class than most would." His acknowledgement of the situation was strangely comforting. These strangers could see the injustice that my own son was pretending not to notice. From our segregated space, I watched the father-daughter dance, Mr. Harrington spinning Natalie gracefully across the floor, to appreciative applause. Afterward, Thomas danced with Mrs. Harrington, the two laughing as she pretended to lead. The absence of a corresponding moment for Thomas and me was conspicuous, at least to anyone who might be paying attention. Aunt Eleanor's words echoed in my mind. "Watch carefully how Thomas treats you at significant life events. Those moments reveal priorities and values more clearly than everyday interactions." She had been right. This wedding had stripped away any remaining illusions I might have had about my place in my son's life. As the evening progressed, I became increasingly certain about what needed to happen regarding Eleanor's inheritance. This wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about honoring her wishes and recognizing the truth of who Thomas had become. Throughout it all, I maintained my composure, determined not to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me react negatively. The staff in our room seemed to grow increasingly protective, offering small kindnesses that touched me deeply. The bartender made sure my drink was always refilled. The servers brought extra desserts from the kitchen. The band members shared stories during their breaks to keep my spirits up. These small acts of rebellion from people who saw the situation clearly reminded me that decency existed in unexpected places. The true measure of character wasn't wealth or social position, but how one treated others, especially those perceived as less important. As the evening progressed, I stood at the back of the main ballroom to watch the cake-cutting ceremony. From this vantage point, I could observe without being noticed, just another older gentleman in a navy suit among hundreds of guests. The multi-tiered wedding cake stood nearly 6 feet tall, an elaborate creation of white fondant and sugar flowers that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Thomas and Natalie approached the cake to enthusiastic applause. The photographer directed them through the traditional poses, Natalie's smile never faltering despite how uncomfortable the forced positions must have been. When they cut the first slice together, Thomas playfully offered Natalie a bite. She accepted delicately before turning to the crowd with a picture-perfect laugh. What happened next revealed more about Natalie's character than perhaps she intended. As the cake was wheeled away for cutting, she noticed something that displeased her. Her smile instantly vanished as she beckoned the catering manager. "I specifically requested gold leaf on the 3rd tier, she hissed, though her voice carried enough for those nearby to hear. "This is unacceptable." The manager apologized profusely, explaining something about supply issues, but Natalie wasn't interested in explanations. "We're paying $30,000 for catering," she continued, her voice rising. "This level of incompetence is astounding." The young manager's face flushed with embarrassment as guests began to notice the confrontation. Thomas stood beside Natalie, nodding in agreement rather than attempting to defuse the situation. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately," the manager suggested quietly. "Why should I hide my completely reasonable expectations?" Natalie demanded. "Everyone here knows quality should be delivered at this price point." Unable to watch the poor manager's humiliation any longer, I stepped forward. "The cake looks beautiful," I said, addressing both the manager and the awkward circle of onlookers that had formed. "I'm sure it tastes even better than it looks." The manager shot me a grateful glance, but Natalie's attention snapped toward me, her eyes narrowing. "Of course you'd think so," she said with a dismissive laugh. "We should have seated you with the kitchen staff." "Oh wait, we did." The deliberate cruelty of her comment silenced the nearby guests. Thomas, rather than defending me, gave an uncomfortable chuckle and placed his hand on Natalie's back. "Natalie, honey, let's go greet the Montgomerys," he said, clearly trying to move her away from the scene she was creating rather than addressing her behavior. In that moment, something final and irrevocable shifted inside me. It wasn't just the insult, but Thomas's complicity in it. My son, the boy I had raised to stand up for what was right, was standing with his wife against his own father. With quiet dignity, I turned and walked away, not toward the Windsor room where I had been seated, but to the gift table where my handcrafted chest still sat among the expensive packages. I retrieved it, ignoring the questioning look from the attendant, and headed toward the exit. Before leaving entirely, I decided to properly say goodbye to my son. I deserved at least that much. I found Thomas near the bar, momentarily separated from Natalie. "I'm heading out now," I said simply. He glanced at his watch. "Already? It's only 10:30. "It's been a long day," I replied, keeping my voice even. "Congratulations again. Natalie looks beautiful, and everything is very impressive. Thanks for coming, Dad." His response was automatic, distracted. "Drive safely." No hug, no real acknowledgement. Just platitudes one might offer a departing work acquaintance. As I turned to leave, Thomas finally seemed to notice the wooden chest under my arm. "Is that our gift? You can leave it on the table." "Actually, I think I'll hold on to this for now." I continued toward the door. "Dad, wait." For the first time that day, Thomas appeared genuinely concerned about my actions. He followed me into the relatively quiet lobby. "What's going on? Are you upset about something?" The genuine confusion in his voice was perhaps the most painful part. He truly didn't understand what was wrong with how I had been treated. "Thomas." I was seated with the staff and served leftover food, I said quietly. I wasn't included in family photos or acknowledged in any way during the speeches. "Your bride just publicly mocked me for being seated with the kitchen staff." He ran a hand through his carefully styled hair. "The seating was complicated. Natalie's family had specific requirements. There just wasn't room at the family tables." "There were 20 tables in that ballroom," I replied evenly. "You're telling me there wasn't a single seat available for your father?" "You don't understand how these social events work, Dad," he said, lowering his voice. "There are expectations, protocols that include humiliating your only parent? The person who raised you alone after your mother died? Who worked 60-hour weeks for years to put you through college?" A flicker of shame crossed his face, quickly replaced by defensiveness. "Natalie was under a lot of stress planning this wedding. You're making too big a deal out of this. Would you have seated her father with the kitchen staff?" His silence was answer enough. "I hope your marriage brings you happiness, Thomas," I said finally. "But I won't pretend this treatment was acceptable. When you're ready to have a real conversation about respect and family, you know where to find me." I walked to the valet stand, handed over my ticket, and waited in silence for my car to be brought around. The drive back to my hotel was a blur, my mind replaying the day's events against a backdrop of memories from Thomas's childhood. Arriving at my empty room, I sat on the edge of the bed, still holding the wooden chest I had crafted with such care. Inside was the check I had written, along with a heartfelt letter about marriage, commitment, and family legacy. Words that now seemed hollow given the day's revelations. I slept little that night. By morning, I had made my decision. After checking out of the hotel, I called my lawyer, Franklin, who had also been Eleanor's attorney and the executor of her estate. "I need to see you as soon as possible," I told him. "It's about Eleanor's inheritance conditions." Franklin agreed to meet me the following day. The 5-hour drive home gave me plenty of time to think, to process my grief and disappointment, and to consider what came next. In my living room, surrounded by photos of happier times, I explained everything to Franklin, holding nothing back about the wedding treatment. "I was there as your guest," Franklin confirmed grimly. "I saw how you were excluded from family photos and heard the seating situation from my assistant. Legally, this gives us clear direction regarding Eleanor's wishes." "I'm not doing this out of anger," I emphasized. "Eleanor wanted the inheritance to go to someone who valued family and respect over money and status. Thomas has made his priorities clear." Franklin nodded. "I'll prepare the documentation. The trade school scholarship fund will be established as Eleanor directed. And as she specified, a smaller trust will still be created for any future grandchildren." I spent the next 2 weeks writing a detailed account of the wedding experience, along with other instances where Thomas had demonstrated his changing values. It wasn't easy confronting these painful truths, but Eleanor had entrusted me with upholding her wishes, and I would honor that responsibility. For 21 days after the wedding, I heard nothing from Thomas. No thank you note for my attendance. No acknowledgement of how I had been treated. Not even a text to let me know they had returned from their honeymoon in the Maldives. Then, on the 22nd day, my phone rang with Thomas's number. His voice sounded unusually eager. "Dad! Great news. Natalie and I are back, and we'd love to have dinner with you this weekend. There's something important we want to discuss." "Oh?" I responded, surprised by this sudden interest. Yes, we're thinking Castellini's on Saturday, their private dining room. My treat, of course. Castellini's was the most expensive restaurant in my area, a place I had never been despite living nearby for decades. What's the occasion? I asked. Just want to catch up, he replied, a forced casualness in his tone. It's been too long since we had quality time together. After the complete silence following the wedding, this sudden desire for quality time seemed suspicious, but I agreed to the dinner, knowing what was likely coming. Perfect, Thomas sounded relieved. Oh, and Franklin might have reached out about some family business. Has he contacted you? And there it was, the real reason for the call. Yes, Franklin and I have spoken, I replied evenly. Great, we can discuss all that on Saturday then. See you at 7. As I hung up, I felt a profound sadness rather than vindication. My son was about to learn a difficult lesson about priorities and values, one that Eleanor had foreseen with remarkable clarity. Castellini's restaurant was every bit as opulent as its reputation suggested. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, and original artwork adorned walls covered in silk damask. A maitre d' in a perfectly tailored suit led me to the private dining room where Thomas and Natalie were already waiting. The change in their demeanor was startling. Thomas rushed to greet me with an enthusiastic hug, something he hadn't done in years. Natalie, dressed in an elegant but understated outfit, stood to kiss my cheek. Ashton, we're so glad you could join us, she said warmly, as if we were old friends rather than barely civil in-laws. Please, sit here next to Thomas. I noticed the table was set with their wedding photo prominently displayed, an obvious attempt to create a sense of family unity that had been conspicuously absent at the actual event. You look well, Dad, Thomas said, pouring me a glass of expensive wine without asking if I wanted it. The retirement life must be agreeing with you. I keep busy, I replied simply. How was the honeymoon? This launched Thomas and Natalie into elaborate descriptions of their 3-week stay at an exclusive resort where villas stood on stilts over crystal blue waters. The cost for a single night would have paid my mortgage for a month, but I listened politely, noting how they emphasized the exclusivity of every experience. As appetizers arrived, the conversation shifted subtly. So, Dad, Thomas began, his tone casual but eyes watchful. The construction business must have been good to you over the years. I made a comfortable living, I acknowledged. Nothing extravagant, but I've never wanted for anything important. Natalie leaned forward. Thomas mentioned you owned your company outright. That must have built considerable equity. I suppose so, I replied non-committally, seeing clearly where this was headed. We've been thinking about investment opportunities, Thomas continued. The wedding set us back quite a bit. Natalie's parents contributed, of course, but we covered a significant portion ourselves. It was certainly elaborate, I commented. Only the best for family, Natalie said with a practiced smile. The irony of her statement apparently lost on her. Thomas cleared his throat. Speaking of family, I understand Aunt Eleanor left some sort of trust? Franklin mentioned you were involved with the distribution. Yes, Eleanor named me in her will. I took a small sip of water. She was quite specific about her wishes. We never really knew her well, Thomas said, but family is family, right? Blood connections matter. Eleanor believed character matters more than blood, I replied. Natalie's smile tightened slightly. Well, we're all family now. I consider you as much my father as my own daddy. The sudden affection from a woman who had whispered, "Be grateful you're even here," just weeks ago, might have been amusing under different circumstances. Just as Thomas began asking more direct questions about the inheritance amount, there was a knock at the door. Right on schedule, Franklin entered, briefcase in hand. Thomas's surprise seemed genuine. "Franklin? What are you doing here?" "I invited him," I explained. "Since you wanted to discuss Eleanor's estate, I thought it would be helpful to have the executor present." Franklin set his briefcase on a side table and nodded professionally. "Thomas, Natalie, good evening. I understand there are questions about Eleanor Lawson's estate distribution." Natalie recovered quickly. "Yes, we're just having a family discussion. Please join us." Franklin declined a chair. "This won't take long. I have the official documents here that outline the inheritance structure Eleanor established." He removed several folders and laid them on the table. Eleanor Lawson's estate included liquid assets and property valued at approximately $3.2 million. She established specific conditions regarding the distribution of these assets. Thomas leaned forward eagerly. Conditions? Yes. Eleanor believed inherited wealth should go to those who demonstrated certain values, particularly respect for family and appreciation for the dignity of all work. Natalie's smile remained fixed, but her eyes had grown calculating. Of course, those are values we deeply share. Franklin continued professionally. To determine the appropriate recipient, Eleanor established a character test. She asked Ashton to observe how he was treated by you, particularly during significant life events, such as your wedding. The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly. Thomas sat straighter, a hint of uncertainty crossing his face. "What exactly are you saying?" he asked. Franklin opened one of the folders. "I have here detailed documentation of how Ashton was treated at your wedding 3 weeks ago. He was seated with staff in a separate room, served leftover food rather than the meal provided to other guests, excluded from family photographs, and subjected to public humiliation by the bride." Natalie's smile vanished entirely. Thomas looked from Franklin to me, realization dawning in his eyes. "Additionally," Franklin continued, "I have records of missed birthdays, unanswered calls, and dismissive treatment over the past 5 years. Eleanor anticipated this pattern and created her will accordingly." "This is ridiculous," Natalie interjected, her warm demeanor completely gone. "A wedding seating arrangement is hardly a basis for disinheritance." "It wasn't just the seating," I said quietly. "It was every choice that day that showed where I stood in your priorities. Every decision that revealed how you truly felt about family." Thomas's face had drained of color. "Dad, the wedding was complicated. There were so many details, things got overlooked." "I wasn't overlooked, Thomas. I was deliberately excluded. There's a difference." Franklin removed the final document from his folder. "Based on the conditions established in Eleanor Lawson's will and the documented evidence of the treatment Ashton received, the $3.2 million estate will not be distributed to Thomas Lawson. Instead, as stipulated in the alternative clause, the money will establish the Eleanor Lawson Memorial Scholarship Fund for trade education." Thomas's smile had completely disappeared, replaced by an expression of dawning horror. $3.2 million? You're giving away $3.2 million because of wedding seating? "I'm not giving away anything," I clarified. "This was Eleanor's money and Eleanor's decision. She simply asked me to help determine if you met her conditions." "But we're family," Thomas protested, his voice rising. "That money should stay with family." "That was precisely Eleanor's point," I replied. "Family is about how you treat people, not just shared DNA. She wanted her money to go to someone who understood that." "This is insane," Natalie snapped, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. "It was just a stupid wedding. We were under stress. You can't judge our entire relationship on one day." "The wedding didn't create your attitudes," I said gently. "It merely revealed them." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, his business mind clearly calculating the financial loss. "There must be some way to contest this. I'm blood family after all." "The will is legally ironclad," Franklin stated flatly. "Eleanor anticipated potential challenges and structured everything accordingly. However," he added, opening another folder, "she did establish a separate trust of $100,000 for any future grandchildren, regardless of this outcome. That money will be held in trust for education expenses for any children you may have." $100,000 compared to $3 million? Thomas looked stunned. "Because of how we arranged seating at our wedding?" I leaned forward, looking directly at my son. "Thomas, this isn't about punishing you. This is about honoring Eleanor's wishes. She believed money reveals character rather than building it. The way you've treated me over the years, culminating in the wedding, showed priorities that didn't align with her values." "You could override this," Thomas argued desperately. "You could tell Franklin to ignore the conditions." "I could," I acknowledged. "But that would dishonor Eleanor's intentions and, frankly, enable behavior that isn't worthy of the son I raised." Natalie pushed her chair back abruptly, her composure completely gone. "This is utterly ridiculous. Do you have any idea what we could have done with that money? We have plans, investments lined up." "Plans that apparently required suddenly taking me to dinner after weeks of silence," I observed. Her face flushed with anger. "You ungrateful old man. You're jealous of our lifestyle, our success. You've always resented Thomas moving beyond your small-town mentality." Several diners in the main restaurant turned to stare at the commotion coming from our private room. "Natalie, please." Thomas attempted to calm her, embarrassment evident on his face. "No, I will not be quiet," she hissed. "We planned that entire wedding around impressing my family's connections. Do you know how it looked having your shabby father there? We did you a favor putting him somewhere he wouldn't embarrass you." Her outburst confirmed everything Eleanor had suspected and I had witnessed. Thomas sat stunned, caught between his wife's rage and the reality of what her words revealed. I stood calmly, placing my napkin beside my barely touched meal. "I think we're finished here. Franklin has the documentation you'll need to understand the distribution process. The scholarship fund will help dozens of young people learn trades that built my business and supported our family for generations." "Dad, wait," Thomas called, a note of desperation in his voice. "We can fix this. The wedding was a mistake." Natalie was stressed. I was distracted. "You can't throw away our relationship over one bad day." "This isn't about one day, Thomas. It's about the man you've become, the values you've chosen." I looked at him sadly. "When you're ready to have an honest conversation about that, my door is always open. But not because of money." As I left the restaurant, my phone began buzzing with text notifications from Natalie, ranging from threats of legal action to accusations of manipulation. Later that night, Thomas called repeatedly, his messages evolving from anger to bargaining. I didn't answer, knowing any conversation that night would be about the lost inheritance rather than the lost relationship. The drive home was emotionally exhausting, but strangely peaceful. I had honored Eleanor's wishes and, perhaps more importantly, stood up for the values I had always tried to instill in my son. Whether he would eventually recognize those values again remained to be seen. The following week, Franklin and I began the process of establishing the Eleanor Lawson Memorial Scholarship Fund. The local paper ran a small story about the new $3 million endowment for trade education, generating interest from community colleges and vocational schools throughout the state. While Thomas and Natalie continued their attempts to challenge the will, I focused on creating something positive from the situation. Eleanor had been right about money revealing character, but perhaps it could also help build character in young people who understood the value of hard work and respect. The first month after the inheritance revelation passed in complete silence from Thomas. Natalie had apparently consulted 3 different attorneys, all of whom confirmed the will was uncontestable. According to Franklin, who maintained professional contact with them throughout the process, the financial loss had created significant tension in their young marriage. Rather than dwell on this painful rift, I channeled my energy into developing the Scholarship Foundation. Working with education experts, we established criteria focusing on students with financial need and demonstrated work ethic rather than perfect grades. The first round of scholarships would support 15 students entering trades ranging from electrical work to plumbing, carpentry to masonry. For myself, I established the small trust for Thomas's future children that Eleanor had specified. Regardless of my relationship with my son, any grandchildren deserved support for their education. Family connections mattered, even when strained. 3 months after the restaurant confrontation, I took a week-long trip to Margaret's hometown in Vermont. Walking the streets she had described from her childhood brought a bittersweet comfort. In a small cafe her family had frequented, I found myself wondering what Margaret would have thought of all that had happened. She had always been the peacemaker, the one who could see beyond immediate conflicts to deeper connections. But she had also valued authenticity and respect above social climbing. She would have been heartbroken but resolute, I concluded, speaking softly to her memory over a cup of coffee. Just like me. Upon returning home, I found Thomas's car parked in my driveway. He sat on the porch steps, looking more disheveled than I had seen him in years. His designer clothes had been replaced by jeans and a simple button-down shirt. When he saw me, he stood awkwardly. "Can we talk?" he asked, uncertainty replacing his usual confidence. Inside, the conversation began stiffly. Thomas paced the living room while I made coffee, the familiar ritual buying time for both of us to find our footing. "Natalie and I separated 2 weeks ago," he finally said, accepting the mug I offered. "She's moved back to her parents' place in Connecticut." "I'm sorry to hear that," I replied genuinely. No matter my feelings about Natalie, divorce was painful. "Are you?" he challenged, a flash of the anger he had been harboring. "You never liked her." "I wanted to like her," I corrected gently. "And more importantly, I wanted you to be happy." He sank into the armchair, looking suddenly exhausted. I thought I was. Happy, I mean. I thought having the right address, the right connections, the right appearance was what mattered. And now? Now I'm 32, getting divorced, and realizing I've become someone my mother would have been ashamed of. The raw honesty of his statement caught me off guard. This was the most vulnerable Thomas had been with me in years. Your mother loved you unconditionally, I said. She would have been disappointed in some choices, but never in you as a person. Thomas stared into his coffee. After you left the restaurant that night, Natalie was furious about the money. That's all she talked about for weeks. Not once did she mention how we had treated you. And you? I asked carefully. I was angry too at first, he admitted. Felt entitled to that inheritance just for being family. But then I remembered things you taught me growing up. About treating the construction crews with respect. About valuing people for their character, not their wallet. He looked up, meeting my eyes directly. I couldn't square those lessons with who I'd become. Over the next few hours, we had the most honest conversation we'd shared in a decade. Thomas described the gradual shift in his values during college and early career, the pressure to conform to an elite social world, and how Natalie had seemed to represent everything he thought he wanted. The wedding was the culmination of years of choices, he acknowledged, each one taking me further from what you and Mom taught me. When you showed up in your Navy suit instead of the designer tuxedo, Natalie suggested, I was embarrassed. How messed up is that? Embarrassed by my own father who worked his hands raw putting me through college. We all lose our way sometimes, I offered. The question is whether we find our way back. Thomas stayed for dinner, and then for breakfast the following day. We didn't resolve everything in one conversation, but we established a foundation for rebuilding. Before leaving, he asked if he could come back the following weekend to help repair my weathered deck, something I had been putting off for months. I'd like that, I told him, surprised by the offer. I still have your old tool belt in the garage. The deck project became our bridge to reconciliation. Each weekend, Thomas would drive up from the city, and we would work side by side, just as we had during his childhood summers. As we replaced rotted boards and reinforced railings, Thomas asked questions about my construction years, showing genuine interest in stories he had been too busy or too dismissive to hear before. During these conversations, I learned that Thomas had begun volunteering with a community housing initiative, using his financial expertise to help low-income families navigate mortgage options. It was a small step, but a meaningful one toward reclaiming the values he had once embraced. 6 months after the inheritance revelation, Thomas brought Sarah to Christmas dinner. Unlike Natalie, she arrived with a homemade pie and genuine questions about my life and work. A kindergarten teacher with a warm laugh and practical outlook, she treated me with natural respect that required no inheritance incentive. She reminds me a little of Mom, Thomas said as we washed dishes after dinner, Sarah chatting with my sister in the living room. Not in appearance, but in how she values people. Your mother would have liked her, I agreed. As winter turned to spring, I found new purpose beyond the scholarship foundation. A local trade school invited me to mentor students, sharing practical knowledge from my years in construction. These young men and women, eager to learn and build with their hands, reminded me of my younger self. Their appreciation for practical wisdom was refreshing after years of feeling my knowledge was outdated or irrelevant in Thomas's world. Thomas, meanwhile, made a significant career change, leaving his high-pressure investment firm for a smaller company focused on sustainable development projects. The salary was considerably less, but as he explained, I actually sleep at night now, knowing my work is creating something worthwhile. By the following Christmas, Thomas and Sarah were engaged, planning a small ceremony in her parents' backyard. When Thomas asked if I would stand beside him as his best man, the healing that had begun with a painful revelation felt nearly complete. Are you sure? I asked, remembering the previous wedding where I had barely been acknowledged. More sure than I've ever been, he replied. I want to start this marriage surrounded by people who remind us what really matters. Eleanor's wisdom had proven prophetic. Money hadn't corrupted Thomas's character, but the pursuit of it had temporarily blinded him to his core values. The loss of the inheritance, painful as it was, had ultimately restored something far more valuable: authenticity and connection. As I reflect now, sitting on the deck Thomas and I rebuilt together, I realize that parenting never truly ends. The lessons we hope to impart sometimes take unexpected detours before finding their mark. Forgiveness doesn't erase painful history but creates space for new beginnings. And sometimes, the greatest inheritance we can offer our children isn't financial security, but the example of standing firmly by our principles. True wealth, I've learned, isn't measured in bank accounts or social connections. It's calculated in relationships strong enough to weather difficult truths, in the courage to acknowledge mistakes, in the wisdom to recognize what truly matters before it's too late. Would you make the same choice I did about the inheritance? Have you ever had to stand up for your principles even when it hurt? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need this message today. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and remember that in the end, how we treat each other is the only legacy that truly lasts.